Let's talk more about what happened on Wednesday with AJE from Cairo. He's a non-resident fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institute and also at RUSI. Strong comments coming out. I want to look at the international picture, how the world has looked at this, coming from all parts of the world. From Turkey, President Gül saying this will turn into a civil war, as it has in Syria. Is that likely? The country seems to be polarized, but it doesn't seem to be the same situation as in Syria.
I think that's correct. It's not the same situation at all. It's a very polarized situation at present. That's very clear. I don't think that the numbers really account on both sides in terms of calling this a civil war. In Syria, you saw the country pretty much divided equally. And you saw people taking up arms to the point where you could call it a civil war, and also different ethnic communities. In terms of the dispute between supporters of the former president and the state at present, you don't see that as a civil war. You don't see it as a sectarian divide. The killings that took place yesterday when the security services cleared out Rabaa and Nahda were tremendous. It was excessive use of force and so forth, but it wasn't sectarian. There were sectarian killings, I think, that you could say, outside of Cairo, and we saw maybe 24 churches being attacked yesterday. Again, I don't think that will devolve into a sectarian civil war in Egypt, but we will see, I think, some low-level violence for the coming days, and it could spark off and become much more violent than that.
In order to have successful politics, you need open debate, don't you? And I wonder if open debate is easy to achieve in Egypt at the moment, where there's no tradition from school onwards of the frank exchange of ideas and the free and, if you like, peaceful exchange of ideas. So is Egypt floundering a little as it tries to establish some post-Mubarak democracy?
I think we shouldn't overstate that particular point. If you see over the last 3 years, debate has actually been thriving in Egypt in very unlikely places in civil society up until literally a few weeks ago. Even under Morsi, where it became a lot more difficult to have those open discussions, they were still going on. At the moment, I think it's incredibly difficult to imagine that the same sort of openness and civil debate that you could have seen in 2011 up until a few weeks ago is likely to be the case. I think that eventually there is a chance for that to come back. The problem is that right now the situation is so polarized that people may not even want to engage in that debate. Repression is going to take place, I think, with regards to supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think that the rest of the population is going to be unwilling and find it undesirable, really, to engage in those sorts of discussions for the time being. It is very polarized and tense.
Indeed, and even more tense after what happened on Wednesday. Let's talk about how the army retook power. I wonder if the army metaphorically shot itself in the foot with arguably the most damaging decision of all, and that was before Wednesday, it urging anti-Morsi protesters to stage a mass rally in order to give the army a popular mandate to take tough measures against pro-Morsi supporters. That's almost legalizing street politics, isn't it? And that must have been a big political mistake.
It's a very strange call that was made, to be honest, because the call on the 24th of July asking for people to come out in the streets vis-a-vis terrorism on the 26th of July implied that the military needed a mandate to actually do its job. That's very strange. Some theories are, as you've alluded to, that the military was asking for support and a mandate to do other things. But the reality is that the military's position in Egypt is incredibly strong on a popular basis. It's an incredibly popular institution. So there was no need to actually call for that day. And people are still wondering, why was that day called for? It could have taken whatever action it wanted without calling for that day. And nothing happened since. Now, obviously, people are claiming that yesterday was a direct response months to the 26th of July. I find that rather strange because it was several weeks ago, and no delegation of authority, or tafweed as they called it, was necessary because they already had it.
Okay.
So I think that there are details here that we're not getting very clearly.
So the major challenge is to rescue politics from the street. That's the first
Indeed.
challenge. But we've only got a very brief and last question. I wonder, after yesterday, have attitudes hardened to the extent, after that ferocious violence, to prevent any dialogue, certainly in the short term?
Well, I think those two questions are actually linked because politics in this country, in terms of political leadership, has completely failed. And it's been a failure not just for the past few weeks or the past few days, but indeed for months. And as a result of that, I think we've seen the results in front of us. And I think that at the moment, you'll see those opinions in the street become incredibly hard because they don't believe that political leadership at present is actually capable of taking things forward. And I say that on all sides. Political leadership in this country has failed, and it will take some time before we can see genuine political leadership take back what needs to be theirs.
Indeed. AJE Helia in Cairo, many thanks to you for joining us on the News Hour.
Thank you.
Well, let's speak now to Taha Ozan, who's a coordinator with the SETA Foundation, a non-profit research institute. He joins me from Ankara. What do you make of Abdullah Gül's statement, first of all, that the possibility of civil war could take place similar to the one in Syria?
We should understand what Prime Minister and other Turkish leaders, President and the Foreign Minister, said about Egyptian coup d'etat and what happened after coup in a historic context. Turkey suffered too much through coups in the past, and Turkey paid high prices. Thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of people arrested, tortured, unknown killings. These are all took place in Turkey. So when Turkish Prime Minister is giving a reaction, or President giving a reaction, you should understand they are talking from that background, that very painful past. What's happening today is Turkish leader Erdogan, who was one of the first leaders in the world, supported revolution after January 25th, when Mubarak was ousted. And they took that position in that revolution process. And today, again, Turkey differs from the rest of the world and taking another position openly, bluntly against coup d'etat. And you're right, this process may get into even more bloody in the sense of Syria, because Turkey really afraid of, in a very limited time, coup regime versus people may replace itself, certain segments of society crashing or clashing with other segments of the society, and it may easily take Egypt within the context of Sina, armed groups, different parts of the society, remnants of the regime, Islamists and etc. into a civil war.
And Turks, they must be watching this extremely closely, because the Turkish government is also calling for an emergency debate at the United Nations.
That's right. I think Turkish government and Turkish leaders, tried too much last 1.5 months with US administration and EU leaders. At least do not give any legitimacy to coup regime. But unfortunately, US government, not calling Egyptian coup as a coup, gave legitimacy and green light for Sisi coup regime to do these massacres. And I believe Turkish government is pushing for UN Security Council at least provide some kind of international pressure on Sisi regime at this moment to stop these massacres. It's a questionable thing because it didn't take place in Syria, and unfortunately the actors who did prevent what happened in Syria in UN Security Council may play same role in UN Security Council for Egypt. This unfortunately means more chaos, more blood, and more uncertainty for the future. And also, not only calling for UN Security Council, but Turkish Foreign Minister and other actors within Turkish government also offering a roadmap. And that roadmap is quite clear. Do something for Morsi. He should be released and there should be a technocratic government, and that should be taking Egypt into elections, both parliamentary and presidential, immediately, as soon as possible. I think this is the only roadmap, a solid roadmap can be implemented in Egypt. I hope, and Turkish government hopes, international actors, international institutions, and especially EU and the United States support this idea, and somehow we stop the bloody process at this moment in Egypt.
The Al Aman Mosque in Nasser City is now a makeshift morgue. They're the victims of the government's show of force, apparently designed to swiftly and resoundingly silence Morsi supporters and move them from their seats of resistance. As the hours passed, the number of injured and dead grew.
We want you to come down to the streets and squares of Egypt to say that the coup and its bloody state has ended. I swear to Almighty God, if you remain at home, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi will turn Egypt into another Syria, into a civil war so he can escape execution.
Many answered calls like his, creating pockets of resistance across the country. As the state of emergency came into force, many chose to defy it. Fires burned across Cairo, a continuing symbol of resistance. But as the smoke settles, both sides of the conflict have begun trading accusations. That live ammunition was used is not in dispute, but who used it and in what circumstances is what's now at issue. Government forces can be seen firing assault rifles, and snipers were positioned on rooftops overlooking Nasser City. The Interior Minister doesn't deny security forces used live ammunition, nor that protesters were killed, but he says they were fired on first. And here's the evidence. Protesters take aim at security forces, and police parade stockpiles of ammunition they say were retrieved at protest sites. But protesters say they were armed with little more than rocks and their voices, and the actions of security forces amounted to excessive force and brutality. They accuse security forces of stopping ambulances from getting into Nasser City to treat the wounded. And in the numbers war, where figures of the dead and injured vary wildly between both sides, protesters say security forces are guilty of destroying evidence, setting makeshift hospitals on fire, deliberately to burn bodies and evidence of the carnage. But police say they were the victims of savage violence. A police truck was pushed off the October 6 bridge. Protesters dragged out one of the 4 officers trapped inside. Outside Cairo, 4 churches were torched, police stations attacked and officers killed. After previous violence, the government promised to investigate, but protesters say nothing can justify security forces turning their guns on their own people. Miriam Nahond, Al Jazeera.
Ashraf Khalil is an author and contributor to Time and Foreign Policy magazines. He joins me now live from Cairo. How will the violence in Cairo and across Egypt affect long-term the governance of Egypt?
Well, it's something that looks to have extreme long-term effects and potentially be a long-term source of instability. In the short term, it clears away an obstacle to the transitional government to get on with the business of governing and organizing what they say is this transitional roadmap to get us back to an elected civilian leadership. In the long term, you have basically sent the largest, most mature, venerable Islamist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, sending them back underground as an aggrieved and marginalized group. And they're going to remember that they won every election that they entered. I can't imagine the psychological impact this is going to have on the Muslim Brotherhood going forward, and how they react to this is going to be one of the most telling aspects in the sense of long-term stability for Egypt.
What will be the thinking then at the top of the interim government now, having seen the violence and having seen the condemnation? And I suspect we'll probably see more condemnation when Obama speaks in the next hour. So will they know they've got it wrong, or will that bother them?
I would imagine that the interim government, interim president Adli Mansour, is going to forge ahead as much as possible and try to put as normal a face on this as possible and represent a government going about its business of governing and try to put something tangible on the table as soon as possible. And he's going to be very much hamstrung. The loss of Mohammed al-Baradei from the government is going to loom very large in the coming days, because al-Baradei really, more than anyone else in the government, he was the most high-profile, most credible international advocate. He was putting his reputation on the line, defending this as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and defending this move to America, to the international community, as a necessary step to avoid disaster. So the loss of Baradei as an international advocate is going to be very important for Mansour's government going forward, I would imagine.
Do you see democracy still being on the Egyptian political agenda?
It's going to take a while to, it comes down to a semantic debate about how are you defining democracy. Even if we have successful and peaceful parliamentary elections and presidential elections over the next 6 months, extending into next spring, are these going to happen without the participation of the Muslim Brotherhood? And if the Muslim Brotherhood is angrily sitting out whatever proceedings, doesn't that call into a question the legitimacy of those elections and the true democratic credentials of any government that emerges from those elections? So it's going to be tricky without somehow inducing the Muslim Brotherhood to return to public life. And it's very difficult to imagine that taking place right now.
All right, Ashraf Khalil, many thanks to you for joining us.
One of the main challenges for those simply trying to organize this amount of bodies and process them is trying to keep the bodies from decomposing. Here now, they've started bringing in bags of ice as an emergency scenario, placing them on top of the bodies to try to keep them from decaying. They also have fans set up all around the bodies here, and they're spraying with as much air freshener as they can, but as every hour goes by, the smell of death here intensifies. Now, these bodies should be brought to the morgue eventually, but just processing them and trying to get that organized is taking time.
In Rome, the head of the Catholic Church used a papal mass to call for dialogue and reconciliation in Egypt.
Giungono purtroppo notizie dolorose dall'Egitto.
He said his prayers were with all the victims and their families, the wounded and all those suffering. In Turkey, Prime Minister Erdogan called on the United Nations Security Council to be urgently convened, and he launched a fierce attack on Western nations for lacking the will to prevent the violence in Egypt.
Batılı ülkelere açık açık sesleniyorum.
I'm calling on Western countries. You remain silent in Palestine, Gaza. You remain silent in Syria. 100,000 people lost their lives, and you are still remaining silent. You are still silent on Egypt. So how come you talk about democracy, freedom, global values, and human rights?
As the full scale of events in Egypt becomes clearer, so too the language of condemnation from around the world grows stronger. Here in London, the Egyptian ambassador was called into the Foreign Office to be told of Britain's deep concern. A spokesman said Britain condemned the use of force to clear the protest and urged Egyptian authorities to act with the greatest restraint. As these scenes went round the world, many other countries have taken similar action. In Paris, the Egyptian ambassador was called in by the president, who afterwards issued this statement. France is committed to finding a political solution and calls for elections to be held as soon as possible, in accordance with the commitments made by the Egyptian transitional authorities. Another European nation, Denmark, has reacted to the killings by announcing that it's halting aid to Egypt. Germany told Egypt the bloodshed must come to an end now. The language is getting stronger, the pressure on Egypt is growing. Harry Smith, Al Jazeera.
Our producer, Maisa Khalaf, joins us live on the line from Beirut. And Maisa, I'm just looking at the pictures here. Cars still ablaze, according to these pictures. Rescue workers on the scene, army on the scene, but a lot of chaos and distress in that area. What have you been seeing and hearing?
Yes, exactly. This is what we're seeing. The smoke is still billowing in and around South Beirut. This is a stronghold for Hezbollah. Their cars are still on fire. Buildings, there's residents trapped in several residential buildings. As I want to point out, this is a very civilian-populated area. The area that the car bomb, as we're being told by the Interior Ministry, their office, that this was a car bomb, around 60 to 80 kilograms of explosives. This has created massive aftershocks of explosions in the area. We're seeing bodies being taken to several hospitals around the area. Some wounds, we're being told that the number of wounded is rising to roughly 120. This is from the Red Cross. 17 are dead as of now. There's a sense of chaos in the area. Hezbollah security themselves are on the streets and have been, as we're being reported by people in the area, that they have started arresting Syrians, anybody that was near the area. They have shut down the area along with the army. So it's very hard for the journalists and everybody to get to the area of the explosion.
Maisa, we're hearing reports that an Islamist group has claimed responsibility for this blast and says that actually this was its second attack against Hezbollah and it's promising more attacks. Do we know anything about this group?
This is an unknown group. This is the first time that we hear from them. They are called AJE al-Mu'mineen. We watched the video. They claim responsibility and they say more to come. This comes after less than 2 months ago, another explosion in early July also went off in a parking lot in Dahia in South Beirut. This time, this was not as big as what we're witnessing now. Children have been targeted, as we see scenes in the hospitals. Children and civilians are mostly the scenes of the attack, who have been attacked. This is a very unknown group, but it is something to take in consideration. Ever since Hezbollah has taken the stance to fight alongside Bashar al-Assad inside Syria, there have been threats from al-Qaeda-linked groups and Free Syrian Army claiming that they will bring the war to Hezbollah's area, and this is what we've seen today.
Now, I understand Red Cross are on the scene. They're saying that several people are still trapped in the buildings. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, there are 6 buildings that we were told by the Red Cross that were set ablaze, and they are trying to get bodies of residents alive and dead out of the area. It's been very difficult to put out the fire with all the electricity. I mean, as I said, this is a very dense, populated area, so getting into the area, into the explosion site, which set several other cars on fire, has been very difficult for the for the fire trucks to get down there, along with the army. But right now we have it secured. The army is around, along with Hezbollah, and ambulances are coming in and out from the Red Cross.
Maisa, thanks very much indeed for that. Maisa Khalaf, the Al Jazeera producer, on the line there from Beirut.
Shireen Tadros is live for us in our Cairo bureau. Shireen, Tamarot, they're calling for people to come out on the streets, the stage setting for another confrontation on Friday.
Yes, although right now things are very calm, and I have to say that even yesterday as we were going home during the curfew, we saw that those sort of neighborhood watch groups were helping the police and the army impose that curfew. So that was already happening. Now, earlier on in the day, there was an incident which you were mentioning there in Giza, just on the outskirts of Cairo. According to the Interior Ministry, hundreds of Morsi supporters marched to the governorate building there, throwing Molotov cocktails, firebombs, and torching the building, and then the police force stepped in and started firing tear gas, according to the Interior Ministry. Now, right after that, the Egyptian cabinet released a very strongly worded statement that essentially gave the police the power to use lethal force against protesters, or what they are calling terrorist elements, if the protesters attack either government or public buildings or the security force forces. So wide-ranging powers for the police right now given to them, mandated by the cabinet, but also, of course, by the state of emergency. So really a zero-tolerance policy that we're seeing by the security forces backed by the political establishment.
Absolutely, no indication of any let-up in the crackdown. Shireen, we're expecting to see funerals today for the pro-Morsi supporters, and indeed the Muslim Brotherhood called for people to come out in marches. You say it's calm now. Has it been that way throughout the day?
Well, apart from that incident in Giza, here in Cairo, in Greater Cairo, it hasn't been a massive day of marches or protests if you compare it to the last 6 weeks. But certainly there have been funeral marches for the hundreds of people that were killed on Wednesday. Still widespread anger and I think disbelief amongst many in this country. But it is very difficult right now to move around. The curfew has been imposed. It's been very confusing for Egyptians this evening who were told that at first that the curfew would be imposed at 7 p.m. and then it's been pushed back to 9 p.m. and then suddenly told that it's 7 p.m. once again. But I can tell you that over the last 20 minutes or so, we can see military vehicles being deployed around downtown Cairo, and that curfew is being put in place right now.
Well, Abdul Salam Sidamed is the regional representative for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he joins us live from Beirut. Thanks very much for talking to Al Jazeera. Now, we've heard from the UN Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay saying that Egyptian security forces should be bound by law. But when you hear authorities there openly saying that they're going to use live rounds against violent protesters, to what extent do you believe that this could actually be the case?
Well, of course, I mean, the government had the responsibility to respect lives and to respect human rights, and that is why the High Commissioner called for an investigation on what happened yesterday in terms of the dispersing of the demonstrators. I mean, of course, I mean, everybody should be held accountable to their actions, but at the same time, the loss of life is quite disturbing, and also equally disturbing is the kind of orders that are given to the police. I mean, that they can use live ammunition, because at the end of the day, police, I mean, the law enforcement operation should really follow rules of engagement. I mean, and any police operation should really respect human rights, whatever the situation, even in a state of emergency.
But do you really?
I mean, human life.
Sorry, do you really believe that security forces are going to be held accountable for the loss of more than 500 lives?
Well, they should be held accountable. There should be a credible investigation on what transpired yesterday and what could transpire, what could happen any time during this period. I mean, it is definitely any value, regardless of the disputes about the figures. Any life is valuable, and it should be. I mean, the security forces should really be held accountable to what they do, and the government should make sure that they respect human rights. They respect right to life. There shouldn't be really any abuse, and there shouldn't be, orders that allow the security forces, I mean, to use, I mean, no matter what are the pretexts and what is the accusation. I mean, so it is the responsibility of the Egyptian authorities, I mean, to uphold international standards to which they have agreed to uphold.
I mean, it's all very well, isn't it, saying there shouldn't be, but the fact is there are human rights abuses happening. So what is going to be the reaction of the UN?
Well, the UN should be, I mean, is ready, and express the High Commissioner expressed even from the start of the events. I mean, that we are ready to engage with the Egyptian authorities. We are ready to provide our support. We are ready to put people on the ground to investigate, I mean, the situation and be there in the country. We are willing to speak to various stakeholders, civil society. I mean, every voice should be heard, and we reiterate our readiness, I mean, to visit the country and to be engaging with the officials as well as other people, including, I mean, the opposition and the various political forces in the country. And we should
I mean, everybody who is detained and that any charges, I mean, they should be according to the rule of law, and we continue to be. I express our willingness to engage with the Egyptian authorities in this regard for the respect of human rights.
You've got Turkey, you've got France, you've got the United Kingdom, Australia, all urging the United Nations Security Council to meet to discuss Egypt. Is it going to do that?
Well, I mean, you know that the Secretary General of the United Nations had already expressed concerns, I mean, on the day yesterday, and the Security Council, of course, it is the one that should answer whether they are going to meet, and this is the member state decisions. But I mean, as the Human Rights Agency of the United Nations, I mean, we follow the situation closely, and we hope that also the Security Council also will be on top of the events. But we are responsible of what comes under our mandate and the mandate of the High Commissioner, obviously.
Okay, Abdul Salam Sid Ahmed, thank you very much for joining us there from Beirut. Well, joining us live here in the studios, Bashir Abdel Fattah, Editor-in-Chief of Al Ahram Democracy Review. Thanks very much for coming in this evening. So we're hearing the authorities in Egypt insisting that these protesters, the pro-Morsi protesters, are heavily armed, that they're a threat to national security. Have we seen any evidence of that?
I don't think that there are evidences, concrete evidences for that, but I think they were trying to find an umbrella, a legal umbrella for attacking the demonstrators in Rabaa al-Adawiyya and Nahdat Masr squares, because they think that those demonstrations make some sort of pressure, legal pressure, ethical pressure, political pressure for the government in Egypt now in front of the international community and also inside Egypt, because they declared before that the army supported the demonstrators against Dr. Morsi, and nobody supports Dr. Morsi. But now there are thousands of people that support Dr. Morsi. So they were really in a critical situation. That's why they try to find a legal umbrella for the attack of those demonstrators.
And then today, when you hear them coming out very openly saying that they are going to use live rounds against any violent protesters, I mean, what does that make you think when you hear the government admitting that they are willing to shoot their own people?
Yeah, I think the recent administration of Egypt now is really uncontrollable. They cannot lead the country in such circumstances. All the time they are trying to exclude the Muslim Brotherhood and all the Islamic movements in Egypt after the end of June movements and demonstrations. So I think the scene have never been finished yet, and in the next few days we'll find more and more numbers of death and dead bodies. So I think there will be a problem in Egypt. If not, there will be a national reconciliation between all parties and all sides in Egypt.
You really think national reconciliation is possible, even further down the road?
No way. If not national reconciliation, I think it might be a civil war and the violence and another violence in Egypt, counter-violence in Egypt. So I think the way out from this crisis is national reconciliation through Al-Azhar or the church, but we should search for national reconciliation. Otherwise, there will be a civil war.
But in that national reconciliation idea, what space is there for the Muslim Brotherhood to exist as a legitimate entity?
I think Muslim Brotherhood has some sort of miscalculations. Sometimes they exaggerate in their power in society. They failed to rule the country, and also they failed to negotiate with the government for a reconciliation or a compromise before what happened yesterday. So I think they need to make some sort of self-criticism in order to introduce themselves again to the audience and to the public in Egypt, and to join the political process in Egypt.
Bashir Abdel Fattah, many thanks for coming in and speaking to us today.
Bulldozers are clearing the streets in Rabaa, all that's left of the camp set up by pro-Morsi protesters. Soldiers on every corner showing they are back in control. All around are signs of Wednesday's fighting. This used to be the camp's medical centre, filled with the wounded and dying on Wednesday. Now it is a burnt-out shell. So too the Rabaa Mosque just a few yards away. On site, a senior police general, congratulated by onlookers. The military government announced it will renovate this place, perhaps to erase any trace of what happened.
Hundreds of people have come to see the devastation for themselves, many of them taking pictures with their phones, and most of them are residents of the local area.
And it is striking how little sympathy any of these people have for those who lost their lives during the course of Wednesday's operation. You have martial law now.
Yes, that's right.
For at least a month.
Right.
What do you think about Egypt's future today?
Well, I hope we are going to a bright future, but we have to get rid of all of these people. What they, they have the word of Muslim, but they are not Muslim.
If Morsi believed in God and knew that people would die, he would have stepped down. But he is a non-believer.
Looking down from a poster, the military in ideal, a soldier cradling a young child. In Rabat today, for some people, despite all that happened here, they are heroes in a divided country. Simon McGregor-Wood, Al Jazeera, Rabat in Nasser City.
These are the images leading American newscasts. A full day after the crackdown in Egypt began, President Barack Obama interrupted his holiday to address the violence.
While we want to sustain our relationship with Egypt, our traditional cooperation cannot continue as usual when civilians are being killed in the streets and rights are being rolled back.
The consequence from the American president, this Egyptian U.S. military exercise, scheduled to start next month, has been canceled. But U.S. military aid has not been stopped. The U.S. gives the Egyptian military $1.3 billion every year, money that undoubtedly helped pay for the symbols of force now on the streets of Cairo. In past debates, members of Congress have been clear on why they want to continue funding the Egyptian military.
If you have any feelings at all for our good friends, our best friends in the Middle East, that's Israel, then you can't consider this amendment.
Making such a significant change to U.S. foreign policy, with all the potential implications for U.S. national security and for our ally Israel, should not be done in haste.
In what could be seen as a nod to the Egyptian military, Mr. Obama did say that he understood why they stepped in and deposed President Mohamed Morsi.
While Mohamed Morsi was elected president in a democratic election, his government was not inclusive and did not respect the views of all Egyptians. We know that many Egyptians, millions of Egyptians, perhaps even a majority of Egyptians, were calling for a change in course. And while we do not believe that force is the way to resolve political differences, after the military's intervention several weeks ago, there remained a chance for reconciliation and an opportunity to pursue a democratic path.
The U.S. president says that is more difficult now, but still possible, insisting the U.S. is not taking sides, but admitting that is not how it's being seen by anyone here, and that is unlikely to change after his announcement. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Bodies filled the floor of this Cairo mosque. In stifling heat, electric fans battled against the smell of death. There was no privacy here for relatives to mourn. The dead were brought from the two pro-Morsi protest camps that were cleared by security forces on Wednesday. But before they can be buried, the deaths must be registered at the morgue on the other side of the city.
What I have been told by the family of the people is that since these were killed, it's not a normal death. They need to be medically checked. And this medical check needs to be done by a special organization, the government. And the justifications they are saying is that there are just not enough doctors to do the check.
Mourners and ambulances jammed the ancient narrow streets that lead to Cairo's only mortuary. There was an endless flow of bodies pushed forward on a tide of human grief. The authorities will only issue a burial permit when the death is recorded. Never before have they been asked to record so many in one day.
It's been chaotic here. It's been difficult to afford much dignity to the dead. Survivors to the relatives is the official record of the manner of death. Many of these people have been shot.
The mortuary was overwhelmed. Bodies were left on the filthy streets outside as relatives were forced to wait their turn.
My relative was shot in the back with live ammunition. That destroyed his liver. He was killed in Rabat. We have a medical report from the hospital proving this, and now we have a burial permit.
This was a tense, volatile place. Any prospect of peace seemed more distant here than it has at any time since Mohamed Morsi was ousted from power. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
The Al Iman Mosque in Nasser City is now a makeshift morgue. The victims of the government's show of force against Morsi supporters. As the hours passed, the number of injured and dead grew.
We want you to come down to the streets of Egypt to say that the coup and its bloody state has ended. I swear to Almighty God, if you remain at home, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi will soon turn Egypt into another Syria, into a civil war, so he can escape execution.
Both sides accuse the other of using live ammunition. Evidence like this shows that was probably the case. Here an apparent member of the security forces takes aim from a rooftop. He is joined by a man with binoculars and a mobile phone who seems to direct his line of fire. This video shows government forces apparently firing live ammunition from the roof of a police station in Beni Suef, south of Cairo. And here members of the security forces fire assault rifles. Protesters say these men firing what seems to be live ammunition were pro-government thugs. The Interior Minister doesn't deny security forces used live ammunition, but says they were fired on first. And here's the evidence, they say. A protester apparently taking aim at security forces. Police have also paraded stockpiles of ammunition they say were found at protest sites. But the protesters deny the accusations. They say security forces acted with excessive force and brutality. They accuse them of stopping ambulances from getting into Nasser City to treat the wounded. And they also accuse them of destroying evidence by setting fire to makeshift hospitals and deliberately burning bodies. Police say they were the victims of savage violence. A police truck was pushed off the October the 6th bridge. Protesters dragged out one of the 4 officers trapped inside. Outside Cairo, 4 churches were torched, police stations attacked and officers killed. The government promised to investigate previous violence, but protesters say nothing can justify security forces turning their guns on their own people. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera.